I keep wanting to say I'm back in Florida. I'm actually back in Japan, and I was going to go for a walk and talk about basically the whole IP industrial complex that plays such a massive part in the whole startup ecosystem and beyond. You know, one of the biggest challenges facing someone doing startups is IP. And here's the crux. Without it, you're not going to get in front of investors. And even with it, unless you have capital to defend it, it's useless. Because anyone can disrupt it or even claim it's theirs or even take it to court. And if you don't have $1 million or more, because that's what it takes to defend IP, it's really, really, really a pointless endeavor. So, how do I propose changing this? And how do we disrupt the centralized, top-down IP global industrial complex that is in the trillions of dollars when you consider the filings, the litigations, the protection, and everything on all the different classes? You're dealing with a massive, massive industry that is embedded in what I call the selfish startup. So how does Foundups handle IP, and how are we going to basically disrupt it? Now, Foundups is a blue ocean strategy. Now, what's a blue ocean strategy? Well, basically a blue ocean strategy is a business model that is not competing in the traditional model. Now, if you know anything about the startup actually is a red ocean. There are many players on it, and it starts at something known as the seed startup. The seed startup basically is when ideas validate themselves, a lot of times because of IP, a lot of times because of adoption, scaling, market share, you name it. These are key indicators of valuation, IP being a big one. And at that stage, then angel investors and VCs will listen to you. However, the vast majority of startups exist prior to that in something I define and call the pre-seed startup. The pre-seed startup, very quickly, are ideas that not necessarily are incorporated, but they can be, do not have accredited investors, and are netting less than $100,000 in revenue. Now, this can encompass ideas, it can encompass businesses, it can encompass all of the stuff. Now, a seed startup is basically ideas that have excess of $100,000 in either net capital profits or in investments, and have accredited investors as part of the team. Because the very key thing is, when you have accredited investors part of the team, then ultimately what you have overcome is one of the biggest hurdles to dealing with a startup, or especially a pre-seed startup. Let's define our term, is access to closed capital networks. Okay, so in all likelihood, if you're listening to this and you're watching me talk here, you are a pre-seed startup. Foundups is a pre-seed startup. I have no accredited investors. We have less than $100,000 in net revenue, and ultimately, we have very little IP. The only IP I have decided to maintain is our registered trademark, Foundup, which is our, that deals with the startup ecosystem. And I'm putting everything else in Foundup in the public domain as for non-profit use. So it's in the Creative Commons under can be used but not for profit. The only persons who can use it for profit is Foundups Corp. So ultimately, which by the way is a really meaningless thing, because ultimately the Creative Commons does not provide any sort of police force to stop anyone taking an idea that ultimately is registered as a Creative Commons for not-profit use, and for them to use it. for-profit use. There's no police force, and that is one of my arguments why the Creative Commons is kind of pointless, because it gives you these distinctions on how to set up and what kind of Creative Commons license you want to use. Share and share alike, there's a whole bunch of them. But one of them is saying, hey, it's not for profit gain. However, there is no, like I said again, no policing of that. And that's where the Creative Commons breaks down. And that's where what Foundups does is something completely different. So, how does Foundups handle IP? Well, Foundups launch as projects of Foundups Corporation. Foundups Corporation is a legal entity, and it basically allows anyone to launch projects from Foundups as a project. So you're not an incorporated vehicle. Now, on an app that we're hoping to raise funds for and develop and everything else on Ethereum, or find developers that will code it with us, and that's what we're on right now and working on. Play Foundups ultimately is a place where you launch your Foundups, you assemble your team, and there is something called the noodle, which constantly validates. Now, the first thing you do when you launch a Foundup is you're going to secure IP. That's it. Why? Because IP is the most important vehicle for valuation in our current startup model, right? Which I call the selfish startup. So, and what's really important is that remember that Foundups are starting as a pre-seed, and the first thing they're doing is grabbing IP. Now, this IP sits under Foundups Corporation, and we hold it on behalf of the Foundup until it reaches level 7. So at level 7, all the IP goes to the Foundup. Now, you may say, well, what's level 7? Level 7 is when the open public placement happens. It's kind of our version of the initial public placement, the IPO, or the initial public offering. So the OPO, the open public offering, is something when a Foundup transitions out of basically its status as a project and ultimately becomes either a subsidiary of Foundups, kind of like YouTube is and a lot of other corporations are to Google, or it becomes its own entity, kind of like Foundups. And at that point, what happens is all the IP and everything else that has been held by Foundups Corp moves to the new peer-to-peer open corporation. So I got to define another term. What's a peer-to-peer open corporation? A peer-to-peer open corporation basically is a legal entity whose bylaws succeed control rights to the blockchain via its articles and bylaws. What that means is basically in order for a board of a legal entity to ratify anything, it has to have approval of its stakeholders, right? Which basically is saying that if you own a stake, which is not a share, it's a stake, it's kind of a new thing invented as part of a peer-to-peer open corporation, then you have voting rights in any determination of that entity. Well, you may say, well, you're not an entity yet, right? Well, that's true. And actually, at level, if I remember correctly, at level 5 you become, or level 4, level 5, I think it's level 5, you become a subsidiary of Foundups. You kind of get your training wheels, and you get a whole bunch of, you get actually a credit card to start spending your money, everything else, as part of Foundups Corp. But until then, ultimately, all action is actually done via the app, okay? Play Foundups app. So, and at level 3 of the Foundup, you actually start laying out what you believe your articles will be for the peer-to-peer open corporation. And ultimately, by setting these measures, dictate, for example, when, how is the CEO replaced? What are the ratifying votes needed via the stakeholders, and so on and so on and so on. Again, all of this done through the app. Remember that, technically speaking, this is not an entity until level 7. So it's kind of like it's a project management system built in the app and what I call the Foundup management system of the app. So how does it work with IP? Well, once you decide on a project or anything else, or a Foundup that you're doing, you're going to secure IP. It could be registering the name, it could be a trademark, it could be patent, it could be anything that you're working on. That IP is held, and what's really cool about our system is it places it in what I call the open IP market on our platform, which ultimately all of a sudden allows anyone within Foundups to basically gain access and use that IP. And what happens is when another Foundup uses your IP, it actually increases your valuation of your project because you are the parent of that IP. So until, and what may happen is someone may execute or come up with a better idea using your IP than you would. In the current model, IP gets frozen, gets locked away, and you have no access to it. So automatically with Foundups, you have access to thousands of IP, trademarks, and other things. In Foundups, we have something known as open brands. So every trademark that we secure becomes an open brand that can be used via any Foundup. Remember, Foundups ultimately level up, and when they become that peer-to-peer open corporation or subsidiary of Foundups, then that's a major thing. That's kind of like Google doing their IPO or Microsoft or anything else. It becomes a big deal. And ultimately, 80% of the net profits and capital gains from a peer-to-peer open corporation rolls back into our seed DAO and ultimately into more Foundups. It's a highly scalable cycle of idea to launch that funds more ideas to launch. And to give you a case in point, if you had invested $10 in Google back in 2000, I think that's when they were incorporated, with all the splits and shares and everything else, that $10 today would be worth $300 million. Now, in Foundups, that took 10 years, and that was basically, imagine if all of a sudden we're launching companies like that, and 80% of that $300 million now is going back into the system for launching, scaling, buying IP, securing trademarks. And what's going to happen is this, is that because we're a blue ocean strategy, because we're grabbing IP before everyone else and securing it for the people, by the people, what's going to happen is very quickly as Foundup scales and grows and starts going faster and faster, we will become the largest IP holder in the world. And this IP will be available for you and anyone else to use simply by being a part of Foundups. What we're doing is disrupting the closed, top-down IP global industrial complex in a very, very simple way by creating a new decentralized way for IP to be shared and used for launching a selfless business model called Foundups. My name is Mike Trout. I hope you enjoyed this talk. You can always go to theselfishstartup.com, theselfishstartup.com, a book that I plan to write once I find a volunteer ghostwriter who will help me with my writing of it in return for some of the sales, but ideally I'd like to make it just free and open source by everyone. So if you are a ghostwriter looking to take my ideas and write it into a book called The Selfish Startup, then I already have the domain. But right now what you can do is go read my white paper, which has a lot of errors because I'm dyslexic, right there, that I've hosted on Hackaday. So go to theselfishstartup.com and learn more about Foundups. Thanks.